We have a technical question. This person says, I have real problems painting groups of bare trees in the foreground of snowy scenes. I struggle to capture their individual forms, and I often over or under do the branches. Yeah, that's a technical question. And maybe some brush strokes might help with that one. Well, every time we get a question like this, I always wonder, well, what is the time of day? Is the sun out? Do we have direct light, or is it overcast? How much snow? Where is, there are all kinds of variables. So when we come down to the question itself, the person said they were having trouble identifying. I'm revising the language now, or not identifying, expressing the forms of the tree trunks and the foliage of tree trunks. And he specifically said those that are closer up in a snowy scene. Well, I went on pixabay.com and found 2 snowy scenes. There are lots of snowy scenes, different kinds of scenes where you might see tree trunks up close and you can detect limbs and that sort of thing. But I just pulled these 2 as examples of different kinds of tree trunks in different ways that we see them. And you can see that the one above, we see just bits and pieces of the trunks themselves as they're moving up, and only really bits and pieces of the limbs as they're coming out. And of course, we have all those little bit twigs and things catching snow that are kind of overall all over the place in the foreground and in the background. And this one's a little different. This, of course, it's obviously been snowing, or maybe there's a light snow on the ground, but it's more in fog now, overcast sky with more fog now. But we can see the images of the forms of the trees, more of them in this one than we can see in this one. So the question to ask yourself when you have doubts about how to do something like that, first of all, the question to ask is, am I looking at textures or am I looking at shapes? Now, this is made mostly of textures. And then what we're seeing in these little dark areas here, we know to be the tree trunk moving up behind and among these twigs. That's shape. So the textures end up being, I think we all know what texture is. Texture ends up being a pattern of many tiny shapes, or they may be larger shapes that are far enough away from us that we are seeing them or perceiving them as tiny. So how would we address the brushstroke of that? Well, if it's texture, if we're seeing texture, then we think about what brushstroke do I need, or what brush do I have that can give me that particular pattern of texture. And so just with that in mind, let's do a little exploration here. So I've just got some colors out here that, well, this is the ultramarine blue and the transparent oxide red, Rembrandt's transparent oxide red. Those 2 neutralize each other beautifully. And so I'm just going to create a neutral here of these in a very dark version. So because it's not the question is not about color, it's about it's really a technical question about how to express these things. So let's pull just a little bit of white over and get that down so that we can get some sort of variation in value, so that I can show you both the textural textural possibilities with brushes and the shape possibilities for doing this sort of thing. Let's start with the texture. One of the best brushes for getting what you think of as many little textures that are caused by zillions and zillions of twigs or grasses or things like that. It's just the rattiest brush you can find, the cheapest, rattiest brush you can find. Now, this is one of my favorites. I think I might have picked that up at the hardware store in a cheap brush, but that kind of brush doesn't need to have a really even tip like this one. You see, this one has this even chisel tip that enables us to control shape. But this is the sort of thing we need. Or you may have your own old ratty brushes that have just lost their integrity as far as their points are concerned or their tips are concerned. That's really, really good for getting this sort of texture. And let me show you. So we can take just the end of something like just a ratty brush and load just the tips of it. See, sort of like I've done right there. Can you see that well enough? So just load the tip, and you can practice this for a little while to kind of see how it works. And be sure that the surface that you're using is receptive to the paint. If you're using a fresh canvas, be sure that it's either slightly damp. I usually slightly dampen mine just a little bit, not much, so that I can just see a bare little shine on my fingertips with an oil that has been thinned a bit with a solvent. So mine is a 50-50 combination of Gamsol, which is a solvent, and poppy oil, which is an oil. It could be linseed oil just as well. But the surface needs to be receptive or your textural strokes won't work. It can also, the textural strokes can also go well on wet paint. But let's just show you this. Now, I have that stuff on the end of the brush, and it needs to be loaded sparingly, not really gunked up, but sparingly, so that you can, so that the tip, the bristles of the brush are still splayed out from each other. We don't want them close together when we're doing this sort of thing. Then the next thing is how to move it on the canvas. And so if we're looking at textures like these, then we would look at the direction of the pattern of the texture. So if textures like these, or even those in the distance right here, we might move that brush. You see there what that does? And you can also see that that would communicate grasses. Really good way of communicating the loose grasses, unmowed grasses that we often see in fields and things like that. It's a technique that you put variations on. I'm not saying this is the only way to do it. And what I'm saying, this is a place to start, but then if you start connecting those things together and moving them in the same direction, then you begin to get a pattern. And then if you look at the direction of movement such as you see here, well, see this one right back here, then if you just allow your brush to barely touch the surface, push down and pull it rapidly in the direction you see, then you begin to develop that kind of texture that will communicate that. And so was one way. Now, you might try that same thing with various kinds of brushes for that sort of texture. Well, let's get a little bit of variation now. I'm going to vary the value a little bit. And by the way, in a snow scene, pay attention to the value of the texture that you make. If you see right here, this is this is sort of it's not a white sky, it's a very light grayish sky. But you can see that the textures that we see back here, the twigs and whatever we see back here, are a lot lighter in value than these are up close. So observation means an awful lot. Well, we'll put this more right here. So I'm going to build a surface here that might allow us to answer the viewer's question about forming the shapes. And so we'll just do that sort of thing. And we wouldn't necessarily have to put it everywhere, but you can see now how that might communicate or begin to communicate the twiggy kind of stuff that we see here. Now, what about when the images get closer to us, which is what you really ask about? Typically, people might take a round brush or a heavy twigger like this brush, and they might simply make a stroke that goes straight up. One thing, observing the movement, the directional movement of the tree trunk itself will guide your hand as to how you need to move the brush. And so, say if we take a There are many brushes that you can use this with, but I'll just start out. This is a filbert. This is a number 4 bristle filbert. It's a common brush, easy to find. And let's just take that brush and see how we might use it to communicate the tree trunks up closer, or what we might see in the tree trunks up closer, but not overdo and not make them fake. And then what would we do with those limbs? So up closer, they'll be a little darker, and so we'll just pull, and I'm keeping this in that neutral. I'm trying not to use a color here. I just want to show this in a neutral. All right, so they might be, and I know we need a little bit more paint on the brush for that. Now, for those kinds of things, I like to dampen the brush and then dampen it in solvent, and then wipe it really good for this sort of stroke. Now, this is sort of stroke you would practice ahead of time before you actually try to execute it in a painting. I like to load the brush by pulling it, pull the paint out relatively smooth on the palette, and load the brush on both sides. So you have plenty of paint in the brush on both sides. Not all gunked up, because then you lose control, but plenty of paint in the brush on both sides. And then you have the ability, if you do that, you have the ability to make, let's go over here, to make a relatively thin stroke with the tip of a filbert brush. No, it doesn't need any special brushes. You don't need any expensive brushes for that, and you certainly don't need those specialty brushes. Just learn how to use the old-fashioned filbert, old-fashioned bristle filbert, I should say. And of course, this is for oil, but in a similar technique will work with acrylic, except you need to use brushes that are especially designed for acrylic, because the bristle brushes don't like to be wet. They don't like water. They kind of get limp when you put water in them. But that's the only difference. Okay. Now you see there, by just using the tip of the brush and pulling it in the direction. Let's pull this again. It's the way you load the brush and the direction in which you pull it. Now, let's look at a specific, let's get one that we can see clearly. Let's look at the specific form. Photographs never show us all the things that we need to see in order to communicate images. So when we have a photograph, a lot of stuff gets taken away. If you're standing there looking at this tree, and then you take a picture of it, and then you take your camera and hold it side by side, or hold it to the side, I should say, so that you can see the photograph, and then you can see what you're looking at. You'll find that what you're seeing sees a lot more of the textures and what we would call details in that tree that the camera doesn't really show. So we need to take that in consideration, which means that tree trunk probably doesn't go absolutely straight up. So let me show you something that you can practice here, and you can put your own variations on working with straight. But once again, that's a good idea to keep that brush loaded on both sides. You can see what I'm doing. I'm holding that at an angle, and I'm loading it so that the paint is nice and rich inside the brush, to the point that you see I can pull it to a tip, a sharp tip like that, which is important. Now, if I start with just the brush turned as sideways like this, not like this, but on its as if on its side, so that it moves in this direction, not in this direction. You see the difference there? So if I'm moving in this direction, I'm going to get that kind of width to the stroke, and then we need to continue to reload. Let's get that. See, I just automatically turn it in my finger like that. But then if we use it on the tip, pull it to a point. If we use it on the tip, then we're holding it slightly at a slight angle like that, and pull upward, not pressing really hard, just giving it a little bit of a tug. Pull it upward. Now, if we're going up like that, if we don't go straight up, but if we give it a little bit of a jerk, kind of like you might imagine an exaggeration of how a limb actually grows. kind of maybe with just a little bit of a jerk to give it that actual little variation of movement you see in a gesture that you see in the shape itself. Okay, so then if let's start that again because I interrupted it. But you see, if I start out and I push a little bit harder, the harder I push, the wider, you see, I get the width. When I pull the brush so that the tip is barely touching, you see, then I get the skinny width. Now, let's put those together, put all of that I just talked about together, and look at how you might do that. Now, variations, you'll find your own way of doing it, but there's the way you load the brush, the angle at which you hold it, and the pressure that you put on the canvas, all those things go into how successful that brush stroke is. All right, so let's do that again. Now this time what I'm going to do, holding it on its tip, turning that direction, holding it at a slight angle, I'm going to give it a little tug, and giving it a little tug, pushing a little harder, I get that thick stroke. I'm going to pull, and as I pull up, I'm going to slightly pull back, pull the brush back, pull up, and I kind of skipped around. There we go, pull up. Not pull back too much. If we pull back too quickly, it makes the tree look, like a tent or shape. You want it gradually get thinner as it goes up, and you can allow the tree itself, allow the trunk itself to determine or to tell you just where that needs to happen. And sometimes you can see, like here, it may stay the same width for quite some time, and so I just get a little bit of that going. And sometimes you might have to reload the brush. Sometimes the brush load might not be enough, but let's do that again. A slight angle, tug, push, and then let's give it just a up, stop, up, stop, up, stop, up, stop. And then as we're going up, we will pull the bristles slightly back. And you see, we get a slight taper that way that allows it to feel more organic, like we would see in a tree trunk. And we can now, if there happens to be light on it, if the sun happens to be hitting, if the light happens to be hitting in such a way that we have light, then we can go back on that like this, see, with a less pressure, and get that variation of light. Or even without overworking, you can even come back and hold it like this, sort of like that, where you have the brush parallel but still turned on its side like that. You have the brush parallel, and you can do that sort of thing. Then we can do a similar thing with the belly of the brush. So we'll do that, and then it'll be time for us to close out the quick tip and let you practice this sort of thing. So you can see that the same principle works. The same principle works if you use the belly of the brush, but then you get a wider trunk. You see, if you simply have the belly of the brush, and as you pull it up, you give it a slight jerk. You see, you got to have that well loaded. And I didn't have enough paint on it, which was a good thing for you to see, because but if the paint needs to be evenly distributed on both sides of the brush's belly like that. Okay, push up, and then as I go up, I'll give it slight jerk, slight jerk, slight jerk, slight jerk. Now sometimes you can do the same thing coming down, where you are starting at the top and just the tip with slight bend on it, and as you come down, you press a little bit harder. You see how it gets wider as I press harder? And then of course you can smooth out where you need to smooth out, but you see you get more of a natural shape of the tree when you do that. Now that is just a very basic suggestion to you about how you go about using your brush. You might try different sizes of the filbert. You might even try different shapes of brushes, and using just those same approaches, and then see if you can't make your tree trunks and your limbs look a bit more real without, as you say, being overworked. Be sure and view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell, so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section, and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DineMize.com, where I have full-length lessons. downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.